we've been fortunate to work with a variety of organizations, over the years, a lot of really great clients. And what we've seen, though, of course, in working with these clients is that everyone's at varying degrees of maturity, especially as it relates to resiliency, and especially as it relates to their supply chain resiliency as well. So these are a couple characteristics, if you will, of what we've seen and found from those clients that are most successful as it relates to building resilient supply chains. So the first one is just kind of accepting what's going to happen, right? So we need to accept the fact and understand that disruption and dislocation are normal. You can plan for days, weeks, and months. I think a lot of people experience that in the past 12 months. We thought everyone had their ducks in a row, if you will, and then things like unexpected pandemics come, and then we have to react and recover. So I think let's just accept that this type of disruption and dislocation is normal. So that's step one. I think as it relates specific to supply chain and supplier resilience, if you will, we also need to acknowledge that, our third, and I'll call it end parties even, so fourth, fifth, et cetera, parties are really important in this overall resiliency journey, if you will. So those who take an approach of embracing their vendors and suppliers, building strong, transparent relationships with them, usually pay off in the long run. I think we're taught, I think back to like kindergarten, talking about, sharing and communicating your feelings. That communication is key here, obviously, throughout this process. But it's also important through this is also empowering those who are close to the action. Far too often, and if you think about, ServiceNow, workflows, approvals, et cetera, if before you can take action, putting someone through a 4-step approval process, you likely have just lost time in your ability to react and recover. So the ability to build a smart process, we talked about process resiliency earlier, a smart process to empower those close to the data to make decisions, to start that recovery process, will usually reduce your time and the impact ultimately on the organization. The fourth point here, is just, makes me think of a little bit of an industry kind of story, if you will. And this is really about standardizing, your processes, your production facilities, your parts with, interchangeable pieces, where it makes sense. The one kind of thing that comes to mind for me is that, I know a lot of us haven't been traveling like we were in the past. It's, very interesting for people in our line of work who were 100% on the road to being 100% now off the road. We were spending a lot of time, at the airport, on airplanes and things like that. And you would actually have delays, if you will, because maybe an aircraft is broken or you need to have a part, but that part's at another airport for that particular airplane. Well, there's actually an airline in the industry who's made a decision actually to only fly one aircraft type. So now if you think about their ability to standardize and change parts and swap planes and train their downstream mechanics on certain platforms, they've just reduced that risk, if you will, as it relates to being able to standardize their process. I think on the flip side, then I think about then the risk, though, it puts on their supply chain now to make sure that if there is a shortage of parts, for example, for that one aircraft, there's a risk now. They don't have diversification. So you now need to go diversify their supply chain and build resiliency there to make sure that they always have access to the things that they need. And really the fifth piece here that we talk about is really thinking about how can you build processes that are running in parallel or concurrent to each other and not one after the other. And if you're waiting for one thing to end before you start the next thing, oftentimes that's just time right there. So how can we get multiple processes started? ServiceNow is a great way to track all of those processes, if you will, and then ultimately allow you to, again, recover as quickly as possible. So ultimately, we think there's one thing that most resilient organizations need, and that's really about putting their finger, on the right data. And that's really just, maybe share a bit about Edgile. I mentioned we've been in this space for quite some time. And one of the things that, we've made as a decision, if you will, as it relates to our risk and security practice, is that we've tuned this business to exclusively working with the ServiceNow platform and the ServiceNow ecosystem. We believe in the power of the platform. We believe in the ability to build resiliency through the data that is natively being generated on the platform. Think of CMDB, think of APM, think of discovery, orchestration, all the security operations capabilities, GRC capabilities. Now it's all in one platform. And previously, I think a lot of folks who have been doing GRC programs for a while, you used to actually spend time thinking about dozens and dozens of integrations actually across your ecosystem with APIs and things like that to get the right data. Where now with ServiceNow, that data should all be right there, arguably, or at least there's a journey to get it there. And that's why we've tuned our business, to really be working exclusively with the ServiceNow platform. I think similarly, we saw some questions, if you will, around implementation, if you will. And one of the things, it's funny, and I saw one of the kind of the comments there is that I've sat in front of many executives, program leaders, and things like that, and they've told me, oh, GRC, preconceived notion, that this is going to take us years and years, a lot of money, low time to value, if you will, and that it can be arduous. And I think a lot of that comes from experience with doing this in ways where that native platform integration and that data is not all right at their fingertips. We've been fortunate to, as part of our refresh methodology, if you will, working exclusively with ServiceNow, really put a focus, if you will, on how we can address those notions and get folks in running, with quick time to value, if you will. There's a kind of a few approaches and kind of things I'll share about how we've done that. One thing, and I kind of joke when I'm on the phone, having this discussion, is we actually say to folks, we want to focus actually on the workflows and the technology last. And it's funny, people are like, oh, well, ServiceNow, workflow, technology enablement, this is what we need. And we actually say we want to focus first on reporting first, and ultimately then next that process piece, that process resiliency that we spoke about. Let's go understand what data and intelligence you want from the platform. Let's go build a resilient process, and then let's go smartly apply technology and workflows to that. And that's been really important kind of guiding principle for us in North Star to make sure that we're getting that process right and that data right so that we can get that reporting. We know technology's important, the workflow and automation is very important, but let's just make sure we're focusing on, the data that we're getting out first. I think the second piece there is really making sure, we kind of joke, say, let's not climb a tree unless we have to climb the tree, and ServiceNow compared to other point solutions in this space has extensible configuration options. I feel like on every call that I have with Brandon and many of his peers, we actually educate folks on the ability of customization versus configuration, and really configuration capabilities are quite extensible. So we can work very quickly and very hard to allow ServiceNow to work for us and make those decisions all natively with available functionality coming from the great releases, that ServiceNow's putting into the product and the risk products. That does not require customization, that you typically would have had to have done with other point solutions for these things to work. And then I'll say one of the last things I'll say, and kind of on this topic before we talk about, where's the right data, is let's absolutely though acknowledge this is a journey, and that there are abilities to get high value quick wins. We call them our quick starts. We're getting folks up and running in 6 to 8 weeks on various use cases, all the way from requirements through config to testing and training. And that this is a journey, and let's go take some type of the 80-20 rule, for example, that if we sat here and got every single requirement documented and we wanted to achieve all of that before we went live, we're not making progress. But 80% of the solution, let's go work on that high value stuff, get you up and running quickly, and then acknowledge that there's maybe 20% to go. We can iterate that over time, and you likely will take a lot of lessons learned from using the platform.
Yeah, that's Brian. That's a good point. And to kind of reiterate, I saw a comment also about the point solutions. I mean, we do find when we are implementing ServiceNow GRC that we are able to take out one or more point solutions. Do you have any words of advice on how to actually go about that process of taking out the point solutions as you implement ServiceNow? Are there just some general words of wisdom that you could share?
Yeah, I think it really comes back ultimately to systems of record and that reporting first, idea, if you will, is ultimately where is that data sit that we need to report on? How can we get that into ServiceNow, or build a smart integration, or quickly put a plan in place to retire that? So if that data is not going to show up on a report somewhere or a dashboard that management or leadership is going to be actioning, why keep that system around? Or let's get a path to get that into ServiceNow so that we can sunset that tool. So oftentimes we're being brought, here's all my data. How do I go put it in ServiceNow? But it's actually never used, and no one's looking at it. So it's actually maybe not as big of a lift to get you off that platform, because that data you've been capturing for years might actually be data that you need in order to go run your program. So that's one of the things that we kind of talk through with clients as we kind of focus on that reporting kind of principle.
Yeah. And this reminds me of what Brandon was saying initially about, being able to identify assets. So the first thing you need to do is figure out what you've got. So it's really, and I think this is probably a frustration for customers, is that, we've made this decision, so let's move. But I think I've seen implementations go much smoother when they've taken that time up front to really go out and do those audits and figure out, what are the assets that are critical for us? What have we got out there that we really need to track? Where's that data living?
That's right.
Where does it live? What data do we need to be able to report to management? And just really go through and just do that inventory initially, assets, data, reporting, all of that. And then move into the, okay, now we're going to start to
That's right.
act.
That's right.
But yeah, I think that's a great point of figuring out which systems, which point solutions you can get rid of.
That's right. Absolutely. And we have to acknowledge as well that, I hope that people see this journey as the ability to transform a little bit and take some of the leading practices that you guys have put into the platform. If you want to lift and shift, we can lift and shift. You're not likely going to get the value and the benefit from this, where, use this as an opportunity to go back to, leading practice, if you will, because of that ability to configure versus customize, and taking stock up front about that and rethinking about your processes as you have them today and maybe how they might be able to be optimized tomorrow is an important piece in that transformation. Otherwise, you're going to go take the same thing that you've overly, probably crafted, if you will, in your previous system, and then bring it to ServiceNow. You won't see that value as high as you might expect.
And I think the other point of that is, if you spend a lot of time customizing stuff, making changes, one of the values of ServiceNow is that it's much more easily to upgrade and keep it current, because we do release every 6 months.
That's right. That's exactly right.
So if you're not customizing it, if you're just changing the configurations, those don't break.
They're good.
We try to update. But if you are customizing it, if you're making it special for yourself, because that's the way you've done things all along, then upgrading is going to be a lot more painful.
Exactly right. Now that's an important point, Teresa. It's great that you guys are putting out new functionality, every 6 months, even if sooner, through store releases, and that stuff's coming, right? And if there's really limited need to customize, and we really try to avoid that needing to happen, because the configuration options are quite extensible. So we're usually able to solve 99% of our clients' problems, through that natively available functionality.
Yeah, I think it's just a different mindset. It's the, we've always done it this way.
So change management 101. Yep.
Versus like, okay, wait, we need to sit and rethink this a little bit, and that's hard sometimes. So yeah, so I think that there's a little bit of a cultural thing also that you have to get over.
We've used a technique actually. I'm sorry, we've used a technique actually through using a decision tracker in order to help guide clients on the path to what is the natively available decisions you need to make. So let's go take vendor risk as a great example. In our quick start, we know there's 39 decision points you need to make. And it will be everything from SLAs to notifications to how many tiers you want for your IRQs to how you want to report vendor issues. And if you start going to 40, 41, 42, you're likely getting out of natively available functionality. So that, going back to my point on 80-20, maybe you have those 42nd, 43rd kind of requirements. Let's go talk about the 39, for example, that are natively available decisions. Let's get those up and running. It works. There are hundreds of other customers using it today. And then from there, let's go figure out if we need to go do something else.
Yeah, great points. Great points. Tell us a little bit more about vendor risk.
Yeah, absolutely. So, really what we're getting at here, my point about the platform and the power of having all the data together, is you're seeing a few of the ServiceNow integration points that we're seeing with vendor risk across the rest of the platform. So take business continuity management, GRC or IRM, as well as even application portfolio management, and how we're having, the data is talking to each other and writing back and forth to the various places in the platform. As an example, we're seeing integrations between business continuity management and vendor risk management as it relates to BIAs, for example. A very, kind of natural one is through the issues, findings management, remediation process between vendor risk and integrated risk management. So if you wanted to see all of your findings in one place as it relates to your program, some of those are your vendor risk issues, but there's also other ones that might come from audits and things like that. So how do we integrate a consistent findings process where we're putting the same risk lens on it? So when we say that's a high or critical vendor risk, it's through the same lens that we're running the rest of our IRM or ERM program. Similarly, we're also seeing, going back to kind of compliance requirements that we spoke about before, the ability to map, if you were to send your vendor, for example, a questionnaire, whether it's the SIG or your own supplemental questionnaires, if you will, and if they're not compliant with certain topics, how can we have that traceability back to your compliance obligations? So that tick and tie back, if you will, of the responses that have created issues back to your own compliance obligations and the laws, regulations, and frameworks that you've set your program up for. So again, another integration back to IRM. Another one is into application portfolio management as well. Being able to, if we're onboarding a new application into the environment, for example, that actually can trigger the vendor risk process. For example, you can actually then write back data from vendor risk into APM based on the results that are coming from the supplier assessments that you're doing there. Ultimately, all this, there's tons of other integration points: vulnerability response, security incident response, the asset data coming from the CMDB, really the power of the platform and getting access to the right data so that you can make decisions quicker, automate, and then recover quickly. So if we go to the next slide here, Jay, and we're going to get into the system in a quick minute, I promise. So really, this is really to depict here, if you will, what happens when you don't have the right data. We've already acknowledged early on that events will occur. Everyone should kind of know that that's going to happen. And ultimately, without, if you will, the right programs from a resiliency standpoint in place and the ability to make quick decisions, and if you're starting to prepare kind of reactively for recovery, that delta and that ability to recover and the impact it's going to have on your organization is either going to be deeper and slower until you're able to recover. And ultimately, what we're looking to do through building, resiliency through our supplier programs, if you go to the next slide, Jay, is really try to reduce this green line, if you will. So now if we are prepared, and that we do have automation and the right data in place, the ability to communicate proactively with our suppliers, if we're able to have the appropriate backups in place, et cetera, we're able to take advantage of more native resiliency that ultimately lessen that gap, if you will, and the impact that's going to have on the organization so that we have a shorter long-term impact from a resiliency standpoint. So how do we go do this? So there's really kind of 5 ways that we're going to start to go highlight how we think you can move that green line, if you will, to really recover quicker, and to have greater resiliency through your supplier risk programs. First we need to know what are the critical business functions to organization. So what are the things that really keep, your company going? And if without those things, where do we have the most pain and the most impact to the organization? So, using BCM, for example, you can identify what those critical functions are, facilities, applications, et cetera. And then as we kind of transition to the supplier conversation through the combination of BCM and vendor risk, you can identify the suppliers that are supporting those critical business functions. And then through the vendor risk management assessments and portal, understand their risk posture. And we know the risk posture might change actually. So a lot of what we're doing with vendor risk management is building in continuity kind of loops, if you will, and integrations with other kind of third-party data providers, so that if their risk posture is changing, how can we be proactively alerted that something's changed and we might need to reassess? We also know on point 4 that there's one-off events that do happen. There's been some recent ones, in the past few weeks. We need to keep that communication lines open, and sending out things like supplemental requests through the vendor portal in ServiceNow to stay in frequent contact to ask questions. Have you been breached? Have any of your suppliers been breached? To report that information back, raise them as issues, and then being able to kind of work on those remediation plans. And then there's the opportunity to integrate with things like vulnerability response. Now that we've identified our crown jewel assets, well, now are there actual exploitations on those, and where are they coming from? So we can also integrate with vulnerability response. So we're going to bring this all to life now. I'm going to turn it over to Jay here, and we're going to really touch quickly on BCM and vulnerability response. We'll spend most of our time focusing on vendor risk management and those 5 areas that I spoke about before. And we look forward to taking your questions if you have any as Jay walks through this.
Thanks, Brian. Just want to jump over to our ServiceNow instance and start by looking at a dashboard that we have here. And this is a dashboard that we've pulled together that's pulling information from a number of different places in ServiceNow. So starting at the top here, we have a report that's showing us our critical processes and functions. And this information is coming directly out of BCM. So we performed our impact assessments. We understood what our recovery time objectives are, what our maximum tolerable downtime is, and ultimately discovered, what is our recovery tier for these different processes, functions, and services. So this is the first part of starting to understand, how these different aspects of our business and how critical they are to the operations that we're performing. Because now that we understand where the critical processes, functions, applications are, we can start to understand which vendors are critical, which vendors are supporting our critical processes and applications, what assets in our CMDB are most important, what are our crown jewel assets that we need to understand so that we can protect and make sure that we don't have a breach on those critical assets. So this second report here is an example of a report we've pulled together for clients in the past, which is the ability to send out quick supplemental assessments to our vendors when notable events occur. So we took a similar approach at the start of the pandemic. We sent out surveys to key suppliers and vendors to understand, do they have operational difficulties, financial difficulties? Are they going to be on site? Do we need to be concerned about the health and safety implications of our contractors and vendors? This example here is a little more recent with the SolarWinds Orion breach. So the ability to engage those vendors quickly, and it could be as short as 3, 4, 5 questions to quickly understand, has the vendor done an assessment on their part to understand whether they were breached directly or through their third parties, our fourth parties, and start to understand, based on the criticality of these vendors, where do we have exposure based on this notable event? On the right-hand side, we're keeping track of those critical vendors that were exposed. So we had 5 in total that were either directly impacted or through their third parties. And as a result of those, we were able to open issues in the GRC IRM solution to go and work through our response and determine what controls need to be in place, what assessments need to be performed, and we can track those to completion as well.
So Jay, I'm getting some questions about how difficult it was and how much time it took for you to be able to create this view that we're looking at. I mean, this is something you spent weeks sort of massaging the data and making it pretty for us all to look at?
Not at all. No, this data is there already. It's just a matter of pulling it together on a dashboard, coming up with the view of the data that we need to paint the picture for management. So we get that kind of full landscape. And so, we were able to quickly build out this assessment. I even pulled up kind of that assessment builder just to see for folks, how quickly we can build these supplemental questionnaires. It's literally drag and drop. We type out our questions and we can send them out to our vendors. So within hours of notable events in the market, we can engage our vendors and start to understand their impact to these. And then it's just a matter of reporting on those results so that we can show that to management and senior leaders.
So when you get the results back, if I had a new assessment that came back from a vendor, would this graph change for me automatically?
Not this exact graph. This one's specifically looking at that SolarWinds Orion issue, but a similar graph could be pulled together pretty quickly that would pull in that information of that new notable event. So if there was another breach or something that we wanted to investigate, then it can be fairly quick effort.
But if I was sending out another SolarWinds assessment.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. If we were to resend that, yeah.
That's right. It would keep, as you get responses coming back, this graph's going to keep updating, if you will, as those responses are coming.
I watch it change.
Exactly. That's right.
We still have a few here that are in the vendor unsure state. Those are those who have yet to respond to us. So as we get those responses back, we would hopefully see them to move into the none bucket, but they may advance into the yes or yes with fourth party kind of implications. And that could increase this number with our critical vendors exposed, as well as creating new issues for us to go and work.
Great. Okay, that takes care of that question. Thank you.
Absolutely. And so the last aspect here on this particular dashboard is looking at those crown jewel assets. So understanding based on that business continuity impact assessment, understanding based on those vendor criticalities, which assets in the organization are most important. And then we can start to keep track of those different open vulnerabilities. And we can see that we actually have some good work to do in this particular instance, because we have stuff, like our e-commerce gateway here. That's not the sort of thing you want a lot of high and critical vulnerabilities open against. And so this is the sort of thing that if you're running a vulnerability program, you're gonna start to take quick action on these. If this is in front of senior leaders, you're gonna make sure that you're aware of this, that we're patching and we're doing the things that we need to do to make sure that our infrastructure, our assets are protected. The nice thing is this can all roll into a broader risk vision. And so Chris mentioned earlier, as did Brandon, the ability to use indicators to pull in data that's natively on the platform to aid in risk reporting. So we can start to look at all the information that's in the system natively across all the different areas, from business continuity to change management to IT support. I mean, all these different things are on the platform natively, and we can use that data to paint an accurate and real-time risk picture for management. So reports like the one we're looking at here is designed to quickly show up for management for different areas of the business. How are we doing? Patch management, software distribution, some of our identity and access management topics, and really making sure that we're able to pull that information into a nice, clean, consolidated view that helps us understand where investments are paying off and where there's still work to be done.
And I think this gets into one of the comments that we had earlier. I don't find it immediately here, but the idea that the integrations and third parties are so important. So if we had integrations with vulnerability scanning, for example, hardware, and we're pulling that data into the platform, once it's in the platform, then you can report on it here. And the value here is really getting that holistic view of risk across the enterprise.
That's right. Yeah. So getting that kind of continuous monitoring, that live data that's being right there on the platform already. So being able to understand where there's increased risk or where you have control compliance issues, which ultimately impacts those different laws, regulations, and best practices. Having that all at your fingertips and single pane of glass is really the value of the platform.
Yeah. I mean, I think it goes back to the whole data. The data is king. If the data is there, we can report on it, and then you can get a view into how risky is this, what's happening in your enterprise, then what steps do you take?
Yeah, and all that kind of drives to better decision making and the ability to automate a lot of this stuff, because when we start a lot of these programs, we do a seeding exercise, if you will. That's more of a tabletop exercise based on impact and likelihood scales and your risk methodology. But ultimately over time, the journey we want to take folks on is how do we have especially your residual risk scores update automatically. So if you're piping in your supplier risk findings and your BCM results and your vulnerability scans and your incidents, et cetera, all into your kind of centralized kind of risk program and resiliency program kind of framework, if you will, you'll see those scores as well, the kind of on the right-hand side that are really reflecting residual risk. You'll see those change in real time as well. So, this kind of dashboard is really only as good as the data being funneled into it. And the fact that it's all on the platform will make it much easier.
And then this goes back again to what Brandon was saying, the single source of truth. We have a question that came up. It's not really Edgile, but for a risk perspective, will ServiceNow be supporting fair analysis? And we actually do support fair analysis. It's one of our other partners, RiskLens, that we integrate with, that we're able to do that with. So yeah, we absolutely do provide you with the ability to do the kind of analysis that you need to do for your business. We have another question here. Do you get a vulnerability added into this type of dashboard? Does your security team add a risk or issue, and do they tie back to policies?
Yeah, absolutely. So that integration, being able to know if you have a critical vulnerability pop up, being able to either start a security incident response workflow and making sure that we're taking immediate action, mitigating controls, containment, all of that, but also the ability to open an issue and work it from a GRC risk perspective. And we know that if there's an open vulnerability and if it's a critical vulnerability, that risk is higher. So we're able to update the values for a given application or for that infrastructure because we know everything is not as it should be. And so
yeah, and you can get that vulnerability in multiple ways. I mean, you could, as we talked about, integrate with a security scanning tool, for example, yourself. You can use our security operations application, which already has those integrations with those security scanning tools. Once it gets into the platform, being able to use ServiceNow to be able to associate that with a particular policy, a particular control, which then dictates what kind of risk you might have if that control fails. And then the automatically generated issue that occurs that ServiceNow does through an automated process. And then that automatically updates your dashboard here. So yeah, the whole point is to automate as much as possible and give you the visibility you need across your enterprise.
Okay. So, that's really where we see all of this coming together is taking that risk and resiliency view of the world and starting to bring it back together. So, just as an example, I mentioned earlier kind of that COVID related example as well as a quick dashboard that we had pulled together there where we were taking a look at the financial operation and delivery. So just another example like that SolarWinds breach example of the ability to start to source the data, pull together pretty clear understandings. And it was actually analysis like this that helped the client understand from a supply chain resiliency perspective that one of their key suppliers of a key part that they needed for their process was actually likely to experience operational difficulties early enough that they were able to get another vendor in place to provide that part and avoid manufacturing delays on their side. So this sort of understanding and indication that your vendors may have delivery risk or operational risk can really help you avoid downstream impacts to your processes, functions, manufacturing, what have you.
Perfect. Well, thanks, Jay. I don't know if Teresa, if there's any other kind of questions or comments you wanted to chat about as it related to this topic. Hopefully, what we shared was helpful to see and hear about as it relates to building resiliency into your program, especially from a supplier and vendor perspective, but then also leveraging the power of the platform to even bring more intelligence together. We obviously look forward to speaking hopefully with many of you about where you were at as it relates to your journey. And I know, Jay put up here actually our website as well, which has all of our contact information and some more resources for you to go take a look at.